So good morning, good afternoon and evening to all who have joined us today, including fellow garden enthusiasts. Welcome to today's webinar, focused on the remarkable collaboration between Sir Edwin Lutyens and Gertrude Jekyll in the gardens of Hestercombe. In the world of landscape design, few partnerships have left such an indelible mark as that of Lutyens and Jekyll. Edwin Lutyens, celebrated as one of Great Britain's greatest architects, and Gertrude Jekyll, a renowned horticulturalist and garden designer, combined their talents to create masterpieces that continue to captivate and inspire us to this day. Hestercombe, nestled in the countryside of Somerset, England, became the canvas for Lutyens and Jekyll's shared vision. Together, they transformed 7 acres of the property into a harmonious fusion of architectural landscape design and breathtaking horticulture. Throughout this webinar, we will delve into the fascinating story behind this collaboration, exploring the synergy between Lutyens' architectural designs and Jekyll's intuitive understanding of planting schemes and color palettes. Together, they seamlessly integrate the man-made and natural elements, crafting spaces that find creative solutions with an underlying tension between chaos and control. We will uncover the principles and techniques that defined Lutyens and Jekyll's work, witnessing the evolution of their creative process and the unique contributions each of them made. From the terraces and pergolas to the sunken gardens and water features, every detail was meticulously considered to achieve a harmonious balance between form and function. We are honored to have our speakers today, Claire Greenslade, who is the head gardener at Hestercombe, and in her own words, "I love plants and all things green, keen to grow, nurture, and support plants and people, and to find beauty in everything. I have a creative energy. My degree is in fashion and textiles. I worked in printmaking and stainless glass before growing roots into horticulture. I see gardening as an art form." And also we have Tim Martin, and he's the arts director for Hestercombe Gardens Trust. And for 10 years, he has successfully secured funding to support contemporary art exhibitions within the gallery and grounds at Hestercombe. Tim aims to promote conversations and works that link art, landscape, and the environment. And once again, I extend a warm welcome to every one of you, and I encourage you to immerse yourselves in the creative world of Lutyens and Jekyll's collaboration at Hestercombe. Please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A, which will be answered at the end of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Would you like, so shall I introduce us properly?
Yeah, go on then.
So this is Tim, I'm Claire.
Hello.
And the sort of thoughts behind this webinar came about through this painting, really. So I went to school with Lucy Soney, who's an artist, who's also shown at Hestercombe. And these paintings are big canvases, and they come from her when she had young children, and they would scribble, and she would turn them into these paintings, expand them and turn them into these paintings. And when we talked about her work, one of the things that kept coming up was that her paintings were about chaos and control. And we talked about how that's the balance that so many artists are trying to find in their work. And I've just found it really relatable, because to me, gardening is all about balance and control. How far do you let something go? How far do you put a human impact on it and control it? And it just got me thinking, really. So if we have the next slide, it just got me thinking about this balance, and it struck me that the relationship between Lutyens and Jekyll was also based on finding the balance between chaos and control. Next slide. Can we have the next? Oh, there you go.
Just before you do that, can I just, you might be interested. So we're sat in my office in Hestercombe House, and just out of interest, I don't know whether you can see this, but this is the view out of my window.
Nice.
So So kind of that is this.
Yeah, and it just sort of struck a chord that that chaos and control is what their relationship was all about. So if we can have the next slide, that shows the sort of the real formality and the skill of Lutyens to sort of create this layout. Very formal, very straight lines, real bare bones, real structure. And then so if we, if we can see that, yeah, lovely. And then the next slide as well shows, so all these little details. So that's a doorway, one of the doorways into the garden. And then on the next slide, you can see, I always just, when Tim and I talk, I always say it's like Lutyens lays out the bare bones and Jekyll throws a blanket of flowers over the top of it. And I'm sure if I mean, I never worry about there being daisies in the lawn for that reason, because I feel like it was all about the flowering of the garden. And it's all about that kind of fullness. And I think when we think about what was really special about Jekyll's planting is we have to sort of put it in context. So in the UK pre-Jekyll, everything was about Victorian terrace bedding schemes. So everything was very tight, or it was about showing off exotic plants. And Jekyll kind of started putting together grasses, shrubs, roses, herbaceous plants to create these sort of chaotic communities. So I always think like she totally appreciated a standalone flower and the beauty of that, but she would note that if she put it next to this, that plant would really sing. So it's like she makes harmonies instead of soloists, if you want. So if we then look at the next slide, that shows how this is one of Jekyll's overlays onto one of Lutyens's plans. So you can see the rill at the top there, and then you can see the planting in the bed, and then the red area, that's actually the planting in the wall. So she was a real pioneer in her way of planting as well. And one of the things that we get challenged about, probably the most about that garden, is because Jekyll was such a pioneer in the way that she planted, visitors say, but why? Because we stick to this 1904 planting plan, and visitors challenge us and say, why would you stick to that? Because she would have moved on, she would have used different plants. And I sort of think that's true, but my idea of how she might have moved on, Tim's idea of how she might have moved on, we would all come up with completely different plans. And I always compare it to, say if you took a painting from 1904, maybe one of like Cézanne's pictures of still life of fruit, like the colour green in oil paint has evolved and come on so much since 1904, but would you want me to go back and repaint his apples with a better colour green? And that's the kind of argument I'm sticking to with this one.
Can I just say, so I don't think you can underestimate the sort of change from that kind of Victorian planting to what Jekyll and Lutyens were doing. It was kind of an incredible radical time, and in a way it's why we're doing contemporary art at Hestercombe, because Jekyll obviously was a painter before she was a plants person, and so it's really fascinating for artists to see this kind of transformation. Amazingly, and very luckily for us, the Portmans who lived here wanted to keep their Victorian terrace, didn't they?
Yeah.
Whereas Jekyll and Lutyens wanted to destroy it and get rid of it because, you know, they were interested in that kind of thing. And so when they built their garden below the Victorian terrace, that they did it in a way, and I'm sure you'll go on to talk about this, to sort of not acknowledge that Victorian terrace.
Yeah.
But for artists, it's just absolutely fascinating to play with those ideas. If I just talk about very briefly one artist who's called Megan Calver, she took Jekyll's ideas on colour. And one thing that I remember her saying to me was that Jekyll liked things to be correct. So she found some seeds called flame red, and Jekyll didn't like when things weren't called. Oh, sorry, that's my phone. Just take that look. So Jekyll didn't like things that weren't correct, and obviously flames aren't red. But obviously on the Victorian terrace, we often use red sometimes as a colour. And so Megan made a gallery work which was made of giant seed packets called flame red, and they were made kind of in a sense in honour of Jekyll, but and made in the galleries to the size of a Vic. I don't know why it's going. Sorry. They were made to the size of a Victorian bed that we've got downstairs. It's just fascinating to play on those ideas in terms of art.
If you go through the next two slides, they really show Jekyll sort of flowering up the Lutyens side. So the chaos and the control for me are Lutyens is the control. He's laying down these bare bones and this structure. He's almost, if you're thinking of it as a painting, he's planning the composition. And then Jekyll is adding, you go to the next slide, is adding all this colour. And I've added this slide in. Robin and I were just talking about this. Obviously, well, not obviously, Jekyll never came here. So we only have her plans. And obviously I've never been able to talk to her. So we encourage all of the gardens team. Luckily, Jekyll wrote so many books, and we encourage everyone to read as much as we can. And one of the things she often talks about with grey foliage plants is hating this yellow with them. So on the Santalinas and the Flomis, what we are meant to do is having a technical phone issue. What we do is we go through and we cut off all the yellow flowers. This is one that's been left, but it is cut now. And that the sort of getting the right colour and the right tone was so important to her. And if you go to the next slide, that really shows that's our Victorian bedding that's there currently. So it's so different, you know, the kind of like the freedom of Jekyll's planting compared to these really tight patterns that we're trying to make on the Victorian terrace. And it's lovely to be able to play with that. So if you go to the next couple of slides, they just show, you know, all of those three plants in there, the goat's rue, the sweet pea and the echinopsis, they're all lovely individually, but en masse together, they just create something else. And I feel like Lutyens and Jekyll kind of knew that of each other. And on the next slide, please, she layers up lots of plants. But if you look at that wall, the balustrading at the top is the very formal balustrading from the Victorian terrace. So that's like a real like full stop. That's the end of the, you know, Lutyens is kind of really saying, right, that's it. That's your Victorian bit. I'm in charge of the rest, and laying out this structure. When I first started here, this bit really baffled me, because if you go to the next, oh, it's not on the next slide, but I'll show you later. But her planting was so flattened, her planting plans, that I thought these were all huge herbaceous beds. I didn't realize that the red stripes in it were just literally just what was in the wall. Where have I got to? And so the next few slides kind of just go through showing the importance of the Lutyens structure. So we did a webinar last year with Ros Wallinger, who has a Jekyll garden called Upton Gray in the UK. And we talked about the difference of having Lutyens there. So if you have, imagine this rill with very tight planting, you know, in the same kind of controlled way that Lutyens has, would look so alien. And also Jekyll needs Lutyens, the boundaries of Lutyens, to kind of like hold her in, otherwise she'd have a crazy like perennial style garden going on. And then but Lutyens isn't without he's not just about control. He does these really beautiful details. So if you look down to the next slide, we have These feature quite a lot around the garden, and this is a French millstone with terracotta plant pots placed one inside the other. Absolutely no need for it to be there at all, but just such a beautiful little detail. And then next slide, which is a very typical Lutyens, is having these sort of circular steps. So although we've got hard edges, they're quite softened. And the next slide shows, you know, the views at these clairvoyants, so you can look out onto the landscape. So he's, again, almost making paintings, almost framing views exactly like they were in the 18th century, using the landscape around them. I think
at Hestercombe, it's quite, the way that Lutyens linked his garden to the other gardens are very clever. There's a beautiful, when you talk about the Dutch garden, there's a beautiful doorway, isn't there, which kind of and its viewpoint is up to the landscape garden, and which is on the top of at the top of the head of the landscape garden is a temple building. It's very clever at just linking the different parts of the grounds and the views beyond, isn't it?
Yeah.
And really Claire, this might be good to mention that there was an existing English landscape garden before Lutyens and Jekyll came in, right?
Yeah.
Kind of maybe set the stage.
Yeah, sorry, we missed that big bit of information. So we have an 18th century landscape garden designed by someone called Bamfield, who was also an artist, which is why, as a charity, that's why we're looking forward to linking more art and landscape, because, you know, there's so much good design and art in the garden that we want to sort of, that's our ethos, to carry that through. So a lot of the evidence that we have for the landscape garden came from Bamfield's paintings, and we still use those today, you know, to make sure we've got the trees and, you know, they're doing the right things, the curve of the stream is right, and it's an amazing garden.
Yeah, so Hestercombe has got actually quite an extraordinary art history, really, and as I talked a little bit about the kind of radical time of Lutyens and Jekyll, to me, I am really sorry, I'm going to unplug that and throw it out the window. In the 18th century, when Bamfield built his landscape garden, and he was a painter, that again was such a radical time of the kind of birth of British landscape painting. You know, so Bamfield was going out making these topographical drawings of the landscape and the coasts in the southwest of England, at the same time as painting these classical views and creating this Italianate garden. It's the kind of it's such a good history to mine. If you were an artist coming here, it's just amazing history of art, and so it makes us then want to think about the future. You know, we want to sort of be not necessarily a radical place for the future, but we want to, ideally, I would say, build new landscapes, don't we? New gardens or whatever it is, and draw on the history of the past. It's just really important.
If you go to the next slide, because one of the other things that's quite unique here from a Lutyens point of view is, as you can tell from that picture, Lutyens didn't get the opportunity to remodel the house. And none of us mind if you call that house ugly. It's absolutely fine by us, because we agree. Jekyll's problem solving with this was to cover the whole building in Parth-Narcissus, which is great, but it just takes so much management. So it was taken down again. I mean, I'd love to see it gold leafed or Trump oiled or something.
Yeah.
And so, but because of that really ugly house, Lutyens had written to his wife to sort of describe this house, how ugly this house was. But because of that is why we've got this garden. So he basically tries to take your eye away from the house all constantly. So if you look at the next slide, down the sides of the garden are these beautiful rills, which on the next slide you can see like the huge amount of detail that goes into those rills. So down the sides, when you're walking back up towards the house, you're walking directly towards the house, but your eye goes nowhere near the house. On the next slide, you can see he's got this beautiful pergola, which not only frames a view over the Blackdown Hills, which is a very beautiful part of Devon, but they also he also creates all these other little viewpoints, all these other little vignettes through walking through this covered walkway, if you like, and the shadow effects great on there. And then one of the things I always question is this stone that we have in the garden. So if you go to the next slide, we have a stone, a seam throughout our landscape, and this stone is called mortslate. But locally, it's only here that has this little seam. All of the houses, gatehouses for the estate are in a much red ochre, sandstony colour. And I'm never going to find out the answer, but I always wonder whether Lutyens chose to use this stone because he was told to, or because it was on site, available, cheap, or whether he actually chose this stone because he really didn't want to use the red. Because from a planting point of view, if you put, purple wisterias onto that colour, onto that reddy colour, it's not awful, but it's just really very different. It doesn't have the same effect. And then if we go to the next slide, this is the front angle of one of the orangery, which is designed by Lutyens, which is probably the greatest Lutyens feature in the garden. And what's really amazing about this is the yellowy stone is called hamstone, and it comes from Yeovil, which is about 20 miles from here. And it's a beautiful dressed stone. It carves beautifully. And he could have made that whole building out of that hamstone, but he had the good sense to know that if he mixed it with the mortslate, with this sort of local colloquial stone, if you like, that it would help it sit within its environment rather than like it's just been plonked onto the garden. So I think he was quite clever and resourceful in what he had available to him and how to make things gel. Like he made links, but like you were saying, links up to the other garden, but also he linked everything really well in.
But this, this building I think is really clever because even the mort slating in it at the edges, he's actually dressed, doesn't he? They're very, it's so different to when you're in the heart of on the Platts. It's very different. I'm just going to chuck in another artist. We did, just before the lockdown, we did an actual exhibition all about Lutyens, and we had some of his original drawings from India and all over the place. And I commissioned 3 artists to make work in response to Lutyens. One of them, an artist called Oliver Sutherland, made an augmented reality film, and he basically photographed lots and lots of details that Lutyens had made in the stone from all. I think absolutely hundreds and hundreds of photographs. He fed them all into a computer, into a computer program, and asked the computer to make sense of the sort of images that were put into that system. And what it threw out was this extraordinary film, which was incredibly colourful. Where it tried to make sense between different forms in the garden, of different where stones met, where there was different types of stones put together, and we ended up with this extraordinary film, which was obviously a kind of computer's vision. It would be a kind of AI vision, I suppose, nowadays of what Lutyens was trying to do. But it's a great, even just looking at stone. It's a great playground for artists.
And if you go to the next slide,
Claire, first, should you say where this is located? It's kind of between. It's a transition spot for the
orangery. Yeah. Again, so the orangery is kind of like stage 2 of the Lutyens work. So the garden that we've been looking at so far in the slides was 1904, and this was built in 1908. And if you walk beyond this, you're back into the 18th century landscape garden. This was the lawn out the front, was their croquet lawn. We use this mainly for weddings now because it is such a beautiful setting. But yeah, it does kind of like, because nothing is straight at Hestercombe. So we have this formal garden, the sort of parterre looking Italianate one that we've been looking at. And then the Lutyens uses a really clever technique of making a round walled area with a round pond in it, which kind of like throws you off course, takes you down to the orangery, and you don't really like it. It takes you off at a different angle, if you see what I mean. Even though it's all looks formal and straight, it's an interesting way it works.
And
yeah,
then the Dutch garden is beyond that, right?
It takes you, if you
Yeah.
walked literally through the orangery and up the steps, yeah, you'd be in the Dutch garden, yeah.
Yeah, and then that would take you out through to the landscape gardens.
Yeah.
It's a clever way of moving you around. So yeah, the next slide, what I think is really interesting about this is the kind of generosity, if you like, of Lutyens. So he's so keen with this collaboration with Jekyll that it's hard to see in the photograph, but there are holes in the wall there that he has left for Jekyll to plant into. So he must have really understood that this formal structure that he was making needed softening with her planting. And if you go to the next slide, when this garden was first built, there were 17 gardeners looking after this patch and a vegetable garden. We now have six and a half gardeners that look after 120 acres. And so actually getting plants to live in the wall, it has almost become the bane of my life. And you know, I'm sure back in olden times I would have had a young boy that would have been available to just spray them as I planted them, but we don't. And this purple flower here is Berkea. It's a South African thistle plant from the aster family, and it's meant to be it's in Jekyll and Lutyens' plan to be in the wall. And for years I could not get the blooming thing to go in the wall. So in the end I planted it in the bed in front of the wall. When it went to seed, I hosed down as much as I could the wall behind, and then I used some modernity and went and got an battery powered leaf blower, and at full force, full throttle, just blew the seed into the wall. So it took me about 8 years to get to this stage. So I now say that the Berkea is my greatest achievement. And if you look on the next slide, it's even been mentioned in a book. So I'm very proud of myself. And then the other thing I think is quite interesting is that if we look at the following slides, there's kind of two ways that Jekyll uses the garden. So this is the plan of the Plat, which is the most sunken part of the garden. And if you go to the next slide, that's the plan of the layout of the Dutch garden. And in these two areas, Jekyll's design is much more, I mean, I've got a textile background, so this is much more like a surface pattern design. It repeats, you could use, if you coloured that up, you could really use that as a print, repeat pattern print. But it's only in these two areas that she does this. And if you go to the next slide, the beds that she plants up are much looser. There's barely any repeating. You know, like when you go to garden school and they teach you how to design, everything is about repeating plants to have balance in the garden. And actually, she doesn't really do that very much. She obviously didn't read the rule book. And she doesn't do, when you're taught now, you're taught to plant everything in odd numbers, in 3s, 5s and 7s. She doesn't do that at all either. She obviously just threw the rule book away. And the other way that I look at it as a painting is if you go on to the next slide, is the way Jekyll uses texture and how well it goes with the stone. So this is, the front plant is stachys and behind it is a cotton lavender, a Santolina. And I'm never really sure whether her use of texture is so good because she had failing eyesight, or whether it's just because of all of her previous art background. So she was an artist in arts and crafts movement. So she was brilliant at silversmithing, brilliant embroiderer. She was a paint. She had a go at everything, and had a good eye for detail. And just as she grew older, her eyesight was fading, and that's, I think, when she turned to horticulture instead. But if we flick through the next few slides, you can see how well she kind of like just takes the greys and moves them through. And just so in this is this border is called the Grey Walk, and that's the one where I have to cut the yellow flowers off. And it has a really good mixture of grey plants that are, some are like the stachys, really soft furry leaves, others like the eryngium behind it, really spiky holly-like. Then it has blue grasses, and it has the phlomis, and it has yuccas. So it's all kind of like a very muted colour palette, but with this huge texture on it. So if you flick through the next couple, so that's the Achillea and the Gypsophilia, just sort of making a community. Like I always describe it like she makes a community out of her plants. She puts people together, like at a party, she puts people together that she knows are going to get on. So if you look at the next slide, you can see, yeah, you can just see how she builds these groups. And then on the next slide again, I mean, lovely. And then the next slide is of the plat, which is the most sunken part. And the plat, when we've read through her books, she describes this area as where the colours are vibrating. So early on in the season, the pink you can see there is a peony called Sarah Bernard. And then she has these electric blue delphiniums and these orange tiger lilies. And if you go to the next slide, you can see how it changes over in the autumn or later on in the summer. So this is just coming in. This is what it looked. This is a photo from the other day. So we've got the gladioli coming up, the cannas and the delphiniums. And the delphiniums, I'll let you into a big secret about the delphiniums. So there's a few things, obviously we all make mistakes. And I once killed all of the delphiniums. I feel like I'm an Alcoholics Anonymous. My name's Irene Sloan, and I killed all of the delphiniums. What I hadn't noticed was that in the UK over the last few years, our springs haven't been as wet as they used to be. They're actually really hot and really dry. We seem to have summer first and then spring is our recent weather pattern. And I also had never really acknowledged how short-lived some of the modern varieties of delphinium are. So I'd almost describe them as like, you know, you get annuals and biennials. I'd say our delphiniums are triennials. They've been so overbred. They're such short-lived plants that hadn't really crossed my mind. So I had to go up to the big boss with, you know, cap in hand to kind of say, oh God, I'm really sorry. And as I walked up the stairs, he grabbed me and he said, oh, you need to come and look at this. I've just bought this painting. So if we go to the next slide, sorry about the dodgy slide, but so this is a painting by Henry Moon, which is of the delphiniums. We thought it was at Munster Wood, but I think it's Munstead House, but Jekyll's chosen delphiniums. And so Philip, the boss man, was saying to me, look at this painting. He said, I think you've got the wrong colour delphiniums in the plat. It's like, yes, I'll get on it straight away and change them. So thanks to this painting, I'm still in a job. Which is really nice. And this painting is now part of our collection. So part of Tim's job is heading up our archives and all our collections, and currently pulling his hair out, trying to apply for museum accreditation, so that we can really bulk. We've got such an amazing archive here, which the next picture can show you. This is one of Jekyll's drawings. So we were lucky enough to buy one of her sketchbooks, which had it was a scrapbook, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's a scrapbook,
which was really nice.
Yeah.
So we're always collecting as much as we can to kind of go with this link between art and landscape.
We proudly own Gertrude Jekyll's trowel.
We do, yeah. We do. We've got a couple of her vases.
We've got all sorts of things, yeah. But anyway, yes, but very important. And just, you know, that painting to me, and we've got, I think, 2 Henry Moons, haven't we?
Yeah.
Those paintings, you know, make sense for us totally, don't they, to have them?
Yeah.
To inspire us. So it's that idea of, I think, you know, recreating these historic gardens through art is just really, it's really, really interesting. It's really interesting of how, because historic gardens are under quite a tough time. You know, it's like the climate's changing. We're so lucky that Gertrude Jekyll liked
Mediterranean plants because they are coping with the hot summers that we've been having. Whereas, you know, the bedding scheme, for example, we're really having to think about at the moment, and we're using artists to help us think about it, because they can challenge us on things. So with the bedding plants, the trouble is it's very cost effective. It's very costly to do. It's very time consuming to do the designing and the bedding, and it gets changed twice a year. It takes a lot of watering. They're just annual plants. And so working with the artists is giving us a chance to sort of rethink, well, how can these historic gardens still be relevant going forward? Because although we're steeped in so much history, we still want to be so progressive because the people that made these gardens were. So it's kind of finding that balance.
You're having a conversation with an artist called John Newlin.
Yeah.
John Newlin is a very well-known British artist, and you're talking about making a weed garden.
We are.
With John Newlin, because John Newlin loves weeds, and has made extraordinary works. He's made an alphabet of horticulture. But anyway, but yeah, so that's what and we're thinking about next year potentially finding a bit of spare ground and seeing if we can create a new garden.
I love the idea of like celebrating our weeds a bit more, because actually they're our native plants, and whether you could actually make something really tight in a, you know, maybe follow some of the Lutyens design in a way, but almost like a tight parterre type planting, but out of weeds, and like how hard that would be to control. But on the other hand, you know, I was saying to someone today, it's amazing how much, whatever the weather, the weeds just always do so well. You're like, why aren't the plants doing as well as the weeds? So yeah, lots of big conversations. And there's another artist who's been doing a residency here called Rebecca Chesney, who's looking at the ash dieback, which mainly will affect the landscape garden. But do you have that in the States? Do you have ash dieback?
Which is killing all our ash trees.
I'm not a garden expert. I haven't heard of it, but I'm sure someone will be able to tell us.
We're having to cut down 200
we need
trees, which is it's awful.
It's a disease amongst all our native ash trees, and the trees become really brittle and they die back. What's really difficult about them is they then become, we just don't know how they're going to react. They become really difficult. So you can't, when you fell them, for example, they just shatter like glass. So no one wants to climb them to take them down carefully. We have to, probably the 18th century garden is probably 60% ash. So eventually that will all die. And that garden's already been through that with Dutch elm disease. We no longer have any Dutch elm, we no longer have any elms in the garden. So Rebecca's been making a piece of work where she's taken an area of the landscape and she's painted these red lines on all the ash trees, so that you can see like how big this problem's going to be, and so it's going to help us communicate it to our visitors.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a lot of our aim, is just to get conversations going, because hopefully through conversations we can find the solutions to some of these things. That's pretty much, I've got one last slide just as a finale, really. So that's the view out of Tim's window. Lucky Tim.
Tim, you were telling us you've got another exhibition coming tomorrow, I think.
So we open another exhibition tomorrow night by an artist called, so all our exhibitions are based around landscape or based around the history of Hestercombe in some way, but mainly landscape. And so tomorrow we open a show by an artist called Susan Durgis, who is credited with creating new ways of making photographic prints. She's a very important artist in Britain and internationally known. So we're showing 30 years of her work with lots of new work, some work inspired by Hestercombe. So and it's looking like it's going to be a great show.
Oh, it's really,
it? Yeah. So I'll be back in the gallery after this for a little while.
Wonderful. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll open the floor up to some questions.
Great.
So there's a couple of questions from David Pearson. One is, I noticed a small daisy-like plant in walls and steps on my visit to Hestercombe. can you tell me the name of the plant, and was this part of the original plan?
The plant is called Erigeron covincianus, or Mexican fleabane is its common name. I've not seen it written on any of the plans for here, but I feel quite sure that it would have been part of it, if you see what I mean. There are parts of the garden, like the pergola and the where else? So there's a few, and the west walk that we don't have the original plan for. So for example, the planting on the pergola, we've worked with the archivist, and the archivist has spent hours looking at every other pergola that Jekyll would have made planting plans for, and worked out which way the colours should go, what kind of plants she used. So yeah, sorry, long and short of that is there's no evidence of it on the plans that we have, but I have no doubt that I always see it as a very Jekyll-esque plant.
And his other question was, even though Lutyens did not design the house, did he plan the garden to be seen from inside the house?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes.
I think so. And there was lots of there was lots of, so it is beautiful from the house looking down. It is the best. I mean, Tim's
I'm on the top floor of the house. The first floor of the house is now all galleries, and those galleries have an extraordinary view of the gardens, especially the Jekyll Lutyens gallery. There is a sort of famous story here that Jekyll that Mrs. Portman saw it as her view. Her garden was her view, and so if any of her servants looked at her view, supposedly they would be sacked, because it was very much her view. And again, we had an artist that actually made a film about that. Yeah, it's definitely for me, standing in the galleries, it's definitely designed.
Yeah,
it's seen from her bedroom. It's a perfect view from her bed. What was her bedroom?
So moving on, Mark Lutyens notes that there's a link between the Hestercombe landscape garden, Stourhead by Henry Hoare, and the ruined but now restored landscape garden at Simon's Bath, Exmoor, by John Knight, nephew of Richard Payne Knight, father of the picturesque. The owners were all friends and cousins.
Yeah, so very much so. Hello, Mark. So very much so. So especially Henry Hoare and Bamfield, they were great mates, and Bamfield actually designed some of the buildings at Stourhead. So that there was, and also there's another. Is it Haswell behind us, which again was another friend. And we've got an urn in the garden, which is a kind of tribute to three friends, isn't it?
And I think they would have met together, intellectualized together, made their plans together, and it's really lovely because we try as hard as we can to carry on that legacy. So I keep very much in touch with the head gardener at Stourhead, and we have lots of debates because the way they manage their garden is still quite different to here. And it's like, so why do you do that? And they're like, why do you do that? So, and what's really interesting about our garden compared to theirs, I always think, is that I cannot fathom out why, but for some reason, no one seemed to touch the garden after it was made. No one seemed to add anything. Whereas if you go to Stourhead, they have added copper beeches, rhododendrons, more exotic trees that would have come in later to the UK, that we simply wouldn't have had in the country at that time. So in our garden is quite purist. And it's another one of the challenges because people will go to Stourhead and they'll say, well, theirs much more colourful than yours. Why isn't yours like that? And I feel like we're quite lucky in a way that it hasn't been overlaid by lots of different owners.
So I see all our gardens as kind of museum pieces in a way, obviously you can kind of, it's amazing that we've got certainly three gardens that you can walk through separately. But to me, they are kind of museum pieces, and they are sort of each unique.
I just think you can walk into art. That's what I think. And from lots of different eras, you can walk into those historical art pieces. It's like walking into a painting.
Well, and a few years ago, we had a Lutyens Trust America tour came to Hestercombe, and Claire, you gave us a beautiful tour. And then this past June, and actually last September, we were in Hayward in Ireland and saw the gardens there. And there's actually connections. One of the comments was that they would have known of the Hestercombe gardens, and that's probably one reason they asked Lutyens to design the garden at Hayward. And interesting to me was that both of those gardens were set in a existing romantic landscape garden, and they were not for Lutyens houses. So there's definite connections between.
Yeah. And I think we're quite lucky. We're quite lucky that the Lutyens garden was featured in Country Life, wasn't it? Twice, I think.
Yeah.
Within the space of a few years, and it is extraordinary looking at those. We've got copies of those. Well, we've got original copies of those in our archives, and it's extraordinary looking at the photographs and how close they are. To now. It's extraordinary,
I always say with my team, and it's just to do with the amount of people on site, but it's the bit that's lacking through lack of workers is the sharpness. So alongside the sharp Lutyens, obviously that's there and that's solid, but the grass kind of pathways should be dead sharp and dead straight, and what were in the photographs. And that's, when there's so few of you, that's the hardest bit to get. But almost you can get away with nettles this high if those grass bits are sharp. It's quite, so you need that's what's the brilliant thing about the Lutyens garden. You need that backbone. You need what he's put in place is perfect for what goes on top of it.
Well, and you have to say, Hestercombe Garden is an amazing thing today. It's a beautiful garden today, and you talked about it in our webinar on Upton Gray. It almost got lost. I mean, kudos to the Hestercombe Gardens for saving, creating an organization and being able to save it, because it's a real treasure.
Oh, thank you.
It almost got lost in the was it in the 70s by the fire brigade, wasn't it? Yeah.
Well, the fire brigade bought it back though too. So
I know, it's weird, isn't it?
Quite extraordinary. Yeah.
So there's a comment by Judith Tankard. Hello, Judith. A wonderful presentation. I love the silver foliage borders. There's a little comment from her. And then from Andrea Lazarski, is it the ash borer we have to regularly inoculate to slow disease?
Yeah, no, this is a fungal one. This is a type of, I think you call it Shalara, I don't know what the Latin is, but it's a fungal disease, so it's spread by spores. So it's unfortunately for most of the UK, it's already too late. I mean, I'm sure what we're really hoping is there'll be some that will go through some kind of regen, and that there'll be some survivors and some resistance. Plant scientists in the UK are already looking at how to harness that and how doing research.
I have a quick question of my own. What did Gertrude Jekyll have against yellow flowers in larger bushes?
I think it's to do with Judith Tankard might know more about this than me, but I think it's to do with the texture. I think when you've got particularly here on it, where there are yellow flowers coming up is on an area called the Grey Walk, and it's all muted tones, it's all grey foliage with tiny bits of whites and mauves. It's very soft, very muted, and I think perhaps the yellow is just too jarring.
It's too much.
She does use yellows in other places, not much to be fair, but and I think generally people find yellow in gardens. That's why I did the Victorian Terrace in yellow this year, because people find yellow really difficult in gardens. I think it's a great colour, and I'd like to make a yellow garden, but it's quite hard unless you mix it with the blues and the purples, and it's great with that, but it's quite hard otherwise to place in a garden. But I think my guess is that it was to do with the textural kind of muted tones.
I've got a question. At one point there was I read that you were going to restore, I think, was it a water garden down by the gate? Yeah. Has that been done, or is that in progress?
It has been. It's been finished. We've got a slight issue that we can't actually get to it now that it's been restored yet. So because we've got a very complicated relationship with our neighbouring farmer. But yeah, no, it's been restored. It has a little building on its square island.
that's
So yeah,
amazing.
it's a Jacobean water garden,
with a boathouse.
little boathouse.
We're not quite sure how and when we'll be able to open it up and access it, but it's I'll send you a picture. You can share it around if you like.
I'll put it on the website. Marcos, are there any more questions or?
Well, just as a practicing artist, I'm really intrigued by this kind of cross-pollination between, you know, the living garden and how it's being looked after with the, you know, the introduction of art and artists that are working in relation to, you know, the gardens and also to the larger environmental questions. So that's really interesting. I'd love to see that more out in the world. But I will be in the UK in the next 2 or 3 weeks, so I'd love to come by and have a look and
Yeah.
Come and yes, we'll show you around.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
And everyone else has to come too. Whoever's
Yeah.
The gardens are open and well worth a visit. And I'd like to thank everyone that watched the webinar. Thank you too so much for a brilliant presentation. And, you know, if you haven't joined the Lutyens Trust America or the Lutyens Trust, anybody watching, please feel free to join. We welcome new members. And we hope everyone gets a chance to visit Hestercombe in the near future.
There's just one more question from Fiona McCall. Sorry. Do you know if Jekyll was involved at the beginning of Lutyens's design process, e.g. the choice of the stone for the wall, or does her involvement only begin once Lutyens had created his plans?
Not sure. It's a really tough one, isn't it? I think that they would have had conversations when he first came and did recce's here and had a look around, but just because from what I've read about them, they had that kind of close relationship, and he would have had, I'm sure he would have had her in mind and her kind of fingerprint in mind all the time that he was designing the garden. But then as far as we know, she never came here. When I used to work at a garden nearby called Barrington Court, and the first part of the design was done by Jekyll there as well. And the story went that she was just sent a tin of, she was very elderly by that stage, and she was sent a tin of soil, the aspect, and a vague layout, and just sort of filled it in. So I'm not sure how she was working by that point, but I'm sure there would have been a conversation from the beginning just because of their closeness. I always like to think as well, because I think she was I would imagine for that era she was a tough old cookie. And I did interview for a gardener post once someone who told me that in their spare time they were a clairvoyant, and that they had a conversation with Miss Jekyll, and that actually if I employed this girl, she would tell me the few things that Jekyll was a little bit peed off about that I hadn't done. But I also think, like, you know, some of it I do wonder whether she was a canny businesswoman. You know, who's to say where we put the irises are? Who's to say she didn't look around her own nursery and say, well, I've got 40 irises to get rid of, I'll stick those down there on the plan. So who knows? We'll never know.
They seem like collaborators, don't they?
I think so.
Everything you read or hear about them.
Yeah, I think they shared a sense of humour and a twinkle in their eye.
Yeah.
So, well, it's been incredible and you know, very enlightening webinar about Hestercombe. And so I think we'll probably end it there. And thank you very much to the audience for joining us, and hope to see you on the next one in a couple of months.
Bye.
Bye.